Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to be talking about shame and guilt, the distinction between the two, and they must be distinguished, and specifically shame and guilt with reference to the sexes, meaning what is the relationship of shame and guilt to men and women specifically. Does one sex react differently with respects to the feeling of, say, shame versus the other feeling of guilt, and vice versa? So how does shame and guilt apply to men and women? That's the micro scale. And then I want to talk about the macro scale, culture and civilization, and I will argue that a culture can in fact be primarily shame-based versus guilt-based, and that will have a very, very strong influence potentially on behavioral outcomes in those people, specifically the women who make up that culture, who are part of that culture. And then finally, I'm going to talk about why this concept of laying down the law and setting up boundaries with women does not work, or rather no longer works. Okay, that was a mouthful. Let's start with shame and guilt. Now, a lot of people use shame and guilt interchangeably, but they're really quite different. They don't have the same focal object. So I'll take a little quote here. This is an explanation, and I think it's a good summation of, or summary of the differences. The experience of shame is directly about the self, which is the focus of evaluation. In guilt, the self is not the central object of negative evaluation, but rather the thing done is the focus. While guilt is a painful feeling of regret and responsibility for one's actions, shame is a painful feeling about oneself as a person. So listen to that again if you have to, but it's a very, very important distinction that must be made, because they are really mutually exclusive feelings, negative feelings of course, but they're mutually exclusive. They're not really that related to each other. And the primary point of distinction, of course, is the focal object. So in shame, the focal object is the self, and in guilt, the focal object is one's actions, with reference to the world usually, specifically with reference to others. So that's an important distinction. We need to be aware of that. Now I'm going to argue that the sexes, both men and women, react differently to these feelings. It's not to say that shame and guilt are the exclusive province of only, say, shame is the exclusive province of women and guilt is the exclusive province of men. Of course, there's overlap. At the end of the day, we are human beings. There are some vague similarities between men and women. But the tendency, for example, in women to manifest feelings of shame tends to be much stronger than, say, feelings of guilt. And I would also argue that men are much more likely to manifest feelings of guilt than they are of shame. And then I'll move on to the macro scale. Well, why am I saying that women are much more likely to manifest feelings of shame? Well, we've done a couple of analyses in the past few weeks and in the past in general. We know, for example, that women are, of course, hypergamous. Hypergamy itself is very much about one's status in relation to the world. One who seeks to elevate oneself, as it were. And of course, solipsism. We've observed that there's a strong possibility that women are, from an evolutionary perspective, inherently solipsistic. That means most things that the woman views are simply well, not most things, but certainly interpersonal relations and in terms of actions, they're sort of a reflection of herself. So it all kind of reflects back to her. So if a woman is solipsistic, and I think the observation is justified, we've presented a lot of evidence so far, it could be argued that shame is a much stronger feeling in them than guilt. And why? Well, shame, as has been explained, is directly about the self, and it's the focal point of evaluation. On the other hand, guilt does not have the self directly as its focal point, but rather others. Guilt involves a party of two or more, a party of yourself and, of course, someone else, or several other people, or in the case of a nation, many, many people. The the distinction, of course, is that with guilt, it's inevitable, it's unavoidable and inevitable that you will have some, in the feeling of your guilt, you will have some relationship to the external world. It's simply, you can't get past it. So, for example, let's say person A, sees an opportunity. Someone drops his wallet, sees the opportunity, and in a moment of greed, he snatches it up. No one saw it, and he has $50 all of a sudden. But he's not wholly amoral, and so he thinks about it, and he's sort of gripped by guilt. Of course, this person who lost his wallet is walking away, and he's sort of struggling with that feeling. Now, you automatically have two parties involved. One, the thief, the guy who stole the wallet, and the bereaved person, if you will, the person who had the wallet stolen. It's unavoidable. That's what guilt is. With shame, of course, it's in many ways a lot more subtle. Shame, in my observation, doesn't need to have can, of course, rather readily have a direct cause, a sort of a identifiable and recognizable cause, but it tends to be a lot more nebulous. So, for example, a person who feels shame because, who knows, he's overweight, or a female who feels shame because her bust-waist ratio isn't appropriate. I mean, and it could be anything. I mean, these are rather silly examples. But the point being that there is no specific interaction between that person and external parties. So, yes, women, I would argue, are much more inclined to feel feelings of shame. Well, for one thing, the one reason why that's the case is because, as on the whole, women tend not to feel too much regret or remorse. Remember, if you're solipsistic in nature, your focus is the self. You're not focused on the outside. So even in cases where there are external parties involved, it's the question in the female mind, or at least in the back of the female mind, is how her actions reflect upon herself with respect to other people. So it's a question that automatically goes back to the self. So, for example, let's say a woman behaves atrociously at some function or party, and maybe even causes minor damages because she's drunk or something like that. I would posit in a situation like that, and she was amongst friends or what have you, that in that situation, she's not going to feel guilt, say, for the minor damages or putting her friends in a bad light, but rather she's going to reflect back upon herself and think about how it made her look. That's not to say that a man wouldn't feel any sense of shame in that sense. Of course he would, but I think the distinction would be a man would be much more inclined to think about what he did to his friends or putting his friends in the bad light. So I think a woman, it's safe to argue that a woman tends to automatically reflect much more about herself with regards to her actions, even in cases where guilt might be the much more appropriate emotion, because you'll have several external parties involved, the perpetrator or the doer, someone who committed the action that might warrant guilt. But because the female solipsistic nature almost exclusively focuses on the self with relation to the external world, the guilt could be transformed, transmogrified, if you will, into a feeling of shame, even though it's from a logical perspective not particularly logical. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And of course, this dovetails well with the idea that women are more objects than they are agents. After all, that is the difference between hyperagency versus hypoagency. A hypoagent, an object, isn't going to be doing anything, right? She allegedly, at least, has no agency. The world acts upon her. And if the world is acting upon a female or an object, the only reaction that could be produced from that is a reaction of the self, i.e., shame. Let's fast forward a little bit to men. Well, as I said, men are not immune to shame, and they're not immune to guilt. I mean, like I said, there is a rather free-flowing interplay between these feelings, these emotions, but I will argue that men are much more likely to feel guilt than shame. And I'm arguing it from a position of agency. That is to say that men are perceived as agents, and very often are agents. They affect changes upon the world through their doings, and if a man commits an ill or a wrong, then he's much more likely to feel, because he's acting upon the external world, he's much more likely to feel a sense of guilt. As I said, the one man furtively gets hold of another man's wallet and sees he's got $50 out of the deal. And he's plagued by his conscience. That's guilt, because he's wronging another person. Men tend to be much more aware of the external world. Men are certainly markedly less solipsistic than women are, but also because he's a doer by nature. He effects changes upon the world. Action is his middle name, if you will. So a man, because he sees himself, in contrast to what many people claim, I find it odd that people often claim that women are much more focused on relationships. Well, I think it's missing the point. They might be much more focused on relationships, but they're much more focused on relationships as it relates to themselves. I would argue that men on the whole are much more focused on relationships from a much more from a healthier perspective, because men don't see themselves as they're much less inclined to be solipsistic, and they don't see themselves as the focal point of attention in the universe. So a man is much more likely to think about his actions in relation to others, and thus guilt, having several parties involved, the doer and the receiver, as opposed to shame where there's only one party involved, that is going to be a much more likely feeling that manifests itself in men than it would be in women. So I've argued here that women are much more receptive to shame than they are to feelings of guilt. Okay, there's that. Now that's the micro scale. What the sexes feel, how they interact with these emotions, and so on and so forth. I'm also going to argue that on a macro scale, entire cultures can be based primarily, of course not exclusively. As I said, there is a free flow of these emotions sometimes, but there are certainly overwhelming tendencies. So that a culture can be primarily one of guilt and one of shame. And we have a very nice distinction in, say, Western civilization versus Eastern. Specifically, I would argue Korean and Japanese society with strong Neo-Confucianistic principles. Now, one of the reasons for this, say in the West, and I'll begin with the West is primarily a guilt-driven culture. A lot of this has to do with Judeo-Christianity, specifically Christianity. So if we look at the mythology of Christianity, you'll see that the concept of original sin itself is an admission of guilt. A sin, you cannot really sin against yourself. In fact, that's never argued in Christian mythology. Sin is, of course, something committed either against God or against others. So sin itself is an admission of guilt. Given the fact that for the better part of 2,000 plus years, Western civilization was sort of infused with Christianity, it's no surprise that it developed along the lines of a guilt-based culture as opposed to a shame-based culture. That means that the feelings that manifest themselves on a macro scale are much, much more likely to be feelings of guilt than they are of shame. And the basis of Christianity is a basis of relationship. So you have the deity, and you have the worshippers. So you already have a relationship in that. And with heritable sin, original sin, the sin, of course, is a sin against God, against His goodwill, and so on and so forth. That's carried almost like a virus in the worshipper. So that is itself an admission of guilt. That you're essentially in a constant state of guilt. I don't want to focus on that aspect too much, but just enough to demonstrate, to illustrate that Western civilization, having having developed along Judeo-Christian lines and I would say moral thought, but certainly ethical thought and perceptions of the world, tends much more to be a guilt-based culture. And you can see this, as I said, in Christianity, but even in the sense, well, the original, of course, the Old Testament, Genesis, it's a Jewish work, it's not Christian. And you see this in the sinning against God. And you might ask, what evidence I have for this beyond this? Well, I wouldn't call myself an expert on German culture, but I have a good deal of knowledge about not only German language, but German culture. And we can look at the manifestation of heritable sin, that is, heritable guilt, in modern Germany. So, for example, we know that the Nazis committed horrendous crimes against millions of different kinds of people, Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, disabled people, political dissidents, and so on and so forth. That was, well, 60 some odd years ago. And Germans are either taught, I would say primarily taught, it's almost, I would say it's almost hammered into them in the school system, that the crimes of the father are essentially the crimes of the son, which is very much a Judeo-Christian perspective, specifically a Christian perspective. So you'll have Germans who, several generations removed from the events of World War II and the atrocities that were committed, feeling, well, guilty for the sins of the father. And this is basically a manifestation of heritable sin or heritable guilt. People feel en masse guilty for what happened previously. And of course it's not a question of shame, because you have one perpetrator, whether the person actually had done it or not. So if you're actually a Nazi soldier at some point in time who committed atrocities, yes, you could, in theory at least, manifest guilt. The great-grandson, however, has no reason to feel guilt. He was not part of it, but artificially you create an atmosphere of guilt. So this sort of manifest a culture of, that's what I mean by a guilt culture in the West, a manifestation of heritable guilt, heritable sin, and that is sort of transmitted through the generations. And of course, several parties are involved. That would be, I would argue, one of the primary examples of that. But you see it throughout Western culture, because Western culture did develop along Judeo-Christian lines, primarily. Okay, so that's Western culture. But let's talk about some of the Eastern cultures. Let's talk about, say, Korean and Japanese culture. And these cultures, at least in their modern incarnations, are growing astoundingly similar to Western culture in some respects. But more traditionally, they have been shame-based cultures. Now, it's a little more complicated, I'd say, than the simple explanations I offered for the guilt-based culture in the West, but here goes. The shame-based culture, namely the culture of, say, South Korea or Japan, is one in which is primarily driven by a collectivist perception of society. Both of these cultures are much more collectivist than they are, say, the West, and oddly enough, much more shame-based. Although it might not be that odd at all. The individual is subsumed into the collective, and for that reason, his actions are sort of the same as the collective actions and vice versa. A person who dishonors the family name, for example, will feel less guilt than shame, because the collective becomes part of the individual. It's a very subtle thing, but that's my argument, that the collective in such cultures is the individual and vice versa. There's not a whole lot of distinction. Well, that's, of course, changing. That feeling of shame is one of the primary motivating factors, for example, behind suicide. If you were to really simplify suicide, and this is a very simple paradigm I'm offering, I'm by no means claiming it's entirely accurate, but let's say that suicide is either caused primarily by shame or guilt. I would argue that in the West it's primarily caused by guilt, and in the East primarily caused by shame. So, for example, those of you might know ritual suicide in Japan practiced up until the 19th century, seppuku, which was essentially a slicing open of the belly, sometimes followed by decapitation, and also not limited to men. Women would stab themselves in the heart with a kind of knife or a hairpin. Now, originally this was part of the so-called bushido, the code of the samurai, and the warriors would do it because they had lost the battle and they had shamed their lord, and thus, rather shamed their lord, they had shamed themselves in the eyes of the Lord. So once again, the reflections to the self. And in order to alleviate oneself of that shame, of that, not guilt, but shame, the shame one has brought upon oneself, one committed seppuku, the ritual suicide that we've seen, the slicing open of the belly. That, of course, is an overt manifestation of shame. Now, in my recent Korea video, I gave an example of in the 1940s of where a bride commits some sort of ritual suicide, or just commits simply suicide after her husband, her partner, dies of some illness, and that action was then praised by the community and those in the surrounding areas as an act of great duty and honor. Once again, an action based on shame. And it's, to my mind, no surprise that South Korea has quite literally the highest suicide rates in the world. And although the male suicide rates are much higher in South Korea, as is typical, than the female ones, it also has the highest female suicide rates in the world. So shame, these cultures, which are not primarily based on Judeo-Christian notions of heritable sin and guilt, are based on collectivist thought as it relates to the self. The self is a reflection of the collective, and thus ills committed against the collective are actually ills committed against the self, and that is the primary explanation for why that manifests as shame. So these are the distinctions between the two cultures. Now, mind you, this is me just speculating now. This next bit is pure speculation, but Japan has slowly been slipping from, it used to be the #1 suicide nation in the world. Most recently, I think it dropped to #7. Still a very distinguished spot to hold, but it's not quite up there anymore. And maybe it's because the culture is slowly transforming and there's a lot less shame going around. This is just speculation on my part. You see, South Korean culture and Japanese culture are very similar, but I would argue, and based on my observations, South Korean culture has always been much more conservative and remains much more conservative. It's much more resistant than to outside external influence in that sense than Japanese culture is. That's just my observation and my speculation. So maybe that's one of the reasons. But South Korea is still #1 in the world, a dubious distinction, a dubious honor indeed. So shame culture versus guilt culture. And, of course, the sexist respective responses to these feelings and how they navigate and interact with these feelings. And oftentimes you'll hear it argued by, for example, the people who love talking about the submissive Asian woman, which is mythology, that you need to find a submissive Asian woman, or, barring that, you need to lay down the law, establish boundaries, guidelines, you're the man, so on and so forth. Why that doesn't work, or why it no longer works. You see, a female's behavior with regards to others is only mitigated or regulated or curbed to the extent that shame is heaped upon her as a consequence of that behavior. Remember, women are much less receptive to guilt. And I would argue that's one reason why Western women are well, on the whole, there's not that much of a distinction, far worse than, say, Asian women on the whole. I mean, it's certainly not saying that Asian women are a picnic. They're not, and women are women at the end of the day. But that Western women have grown up in a guilt-based culture to which they are, based on their very natures, not very receptive. They're not receptive to guilt so much as they are shame. Now, in the olden days, for example, children born out of wedlock, that was a shameful thing, culturally speaking. It was viewed as a shameful thing, and it was one thing that women sought to avoid because of that shame. There was a large-scale cultural prohibition in the West against that sort of thing. Mind you, it exists almost everywhere in the world, but we're talking about the West now. That prevented a fair number of women, at least, from engaging in adulterous behavior or having children out of wedlock, because they were much more receptive to those shaming feelings. And this is the important point, the culture at large supported that. The culture was a buttress which supported that feeling of shame in the woman if she were to commit that act of adultery or have a child out of wedlock, just as an example. In a culture that no longer has any shame or shame-based principles, and as I said, as I argued, Western culture for the better part of 2,000 years has minimally been about shame and been much more about guilt, where women, by their very natures, are much more receptive to feelings of shame than guilt. The loosening of female mores, if you will, is going to take place at a far, far more rapid rate than perhaps elsewhere. And certainly the levels, the depth of that loosening of personal behavior and mores is going to be perhaps as well far greater. This is why, then this would be my explanation as to why Western culture, particularly the United States, but anywhere in the West, has given rise to the sort of female it has. There is no shame because, well, we've given up on any system of shame. That's not to argue that a system of shame is good or bad. I'm just being descriptive here. Because there is no shame for a woman to have a child out of wedlock. And indeed, it's praised often. Single mothers in society are often praised as heroines and engaging in monumental and difficult work, and no doubt it's difficult to raise a child on your own, but it's certainly praised as something positive half the time. And there is no consequence for female behavior. What does this mean specifically? Well, we know for the most part that women don't feel too much guilt, so whatever actions they committed, if guilt will not be enough of a hindrance to them to prevent them from committing. So women who commit false rape accusations, most men would feel tremendous guilt at if they had done the similar things. They would guilt quite literally might eat away at them for the rest of his life, perhaps. And because you have several parties involved, you have the accused and the accuser. The procedures some women use in splitting up with their partners, I mean, text messages, Skype, under some of the most dubious circumstances. Now, like I said, I don't like bringing up the personal, but when my last ex split up with me, I had a tumor, which at the time it turned out to be benign, had it removed, but I didn't really know. It could have been malignant. I also had an important job interview the very next day, all of which she knew about, and it didn't stop her. I mean, that's what I mean, that there is no sense of guilt. Had the positions been reversed, it's not that I've never split up with women before. I have, although I had been pushed to extremes. Another reason that men tend to tolerate a lot more and are much more patient in that regard. I've never split up with a woman under such dubious circumstances, and had the roles been reversed, I never would have gone through with it in that manner. It's just the guilt would have eaten away at me. So yes, getting back to the point at hand, focal point, guilt versus shame. Well, if women on the whole feel no guilt, yet we live in a guilt-driven culture, it's very unlikely that they're going to show any remorse. If there's no shame factor and no shame element in the culture, What's the consequence of that? What the feeling that women are receptive to, namely shame primarily, is not going to resonate with them. And thus there will be no hindrance. There will be no prevention of ill behavior, either coming from others or coming from themselves, for the simple reason that the cues aren't there. There's no societal cue anymore for a woman to feel shame, whether she's laughing at a man having his cock cut off, whether she's engaging in false rape accusation, whether, textbook. Remember a while back I posted that video of the cab driver in Canada and how these women, basically on a whim, were going to say that he had sexually assaulted them. Of course they felt no guilt. The culture, simultaneously, the culture, Canadian culture, which isn't Canadian culture, it's Western culture. Western culture does not reinforce any feeling of shame in females. This is an element of female psychology that is not being tapped into. And thus we see the dissolute and rampant behavior of the modern Western female to an extent that is just one's left in a state of incredulity half the time. Although the more you see it, the more you get used to it. Although it never ceases to amaze, I suppose. So that is, in my assessment, one of the primary factors why you have Western women just going hog wild, doing or whatever they want. Guilt doesn't register with them, though that's the basis of the culture. At the same time, we have no shaming factor anymore. We have no shame effect, because women can do whatever they want, and they're not made to feel shame because of that. Okay, so let's talk about Eastern culture. As traditional and as conservative as, say, South Korean or Japanese culture are, these things are changing. And that's why 60 years ago, a bride might have committed suicide due to incredible, intense feelings of shame at the loss of her partner, but you're not going to see that anymore, although they do commit suicide for other reasons. Most of the reasons, say, South Korea, which, as I said, #1 suicide in the world, they commit suicide for a lot to do with performance. Of course, men at double the rate than women, but it is a reflection of the self in reference to others. But with a loosening of that, whether the culture is primarily shame-based or not, if there is a reduction in the shame factor, as I'll call it, that will have a direct influence and effect on the women involved in that culture, I would argue. That is why the idea of establishing boundaries and laying down the law, as has been argued by some, doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work because there is no cultural reinforcement. It certainly doesn't work in the West because, well, we know Western culture is primarily guilt-driven as opposed to shame-driven, and women in the West are, well, allowed to do anything, and there's no shame involved whatsoever. And it's being not so gradually, but rather rapidly reduced in Far Eastern cultures such as Japan and South Korea, you can certainly see it in other cultures, the Southeastern Asian cultures as well, which also have very strong cultural distinctions as opposed to Western culture. Although I'm always honest. I don't know nearly as much about Southeastern culture as I do, say, about Far Eastern culture, namely Chinese, South Korean, Japanese culture. And as that loosens, the shame factor will weaken as well, and that will, of course, have a direct effect on female behavior, which means they'll be a lot less receptive to reproach and reprimand. So just as an example, when I reprimanded my ex for her oft-times childish behavior, I often got more of it. Now, you can go on arguing that it's because I wasn't an alpha male or what have you, but that simply doesn't add up. By all intents and purposes, I was an alpha male with respects to her. I was 11 years older, I had an actual income, a lot more experience, and I was, quite frankly, a hell of a lot more intelligent than she was. But she wasn't receptive to it, and I would argue, even though she was South Korean, that she'd lived in the United States for 6 years. Whatever shame culture she had been exposed to had totally evaporated by the time she was in the United States. So that contributed, of course, to this lack of response. And I've had other, full disclosure, yes, I've had other Asian girlfriends. I've had a Chinese girlfriend. I had a Japanese girlfriend once. Mostly I've had experience with South Korean women. And every time and again I can make the same observation, to varying degrees, of course, that these women were no longer receptive to this sort of reprimand, lay down the law approach, for the simple reason that the societal consensus, remember, the societal consensus has become such that it is no longer a shaming consensus. Women are excused for their behavior time and time again. So, do you remember a while back I talked about that Korean report, which was basically lambasting foreign men for allegedly seducing Korean women, and the Korean women were victims? I would argue in a culture that had, or in an earlier setting of Korean culture, where you have a much more heavily shame-based culture, that the women would be shamed in that situation. But in that video, we saw that it was the finger pointing to the Western men who were seducing them and trying to get them pregnant and do all sorts of evil things. So the women were not made to feel shame, but the men were, of course, made to feel guilt for their actions, for what they committed. When the consensus on a societal wide scale is not one which results in shame, women will not respond to it, because women, as we know, are collectivists. And I would argue that shame, for the most part, is a collectivist feeling, because a collective is simply a manifestation of many individuals. It's a bit complicated, I realize, but that is my argument. Women, being collectivists, will respond to collectivist reproach, even if it's manifested in an individual. If you as a man reproach a woman in a shame culture where that shame culture is reinforced and reflects the societal consensus, she will respond to it. That doesn't mean that she's a good loving wife or a good loving girlfriend. It has nothing to do with that. It simply means that the culture will back up your reproach, in the sense that it will reinforce her much stronger tendency and receptiveness to feelings of shame. Absent that, it doesn't matter if you reproach her or not, and the culture is not going to back that up. This is why you have women acting like spoiled little brats, getting away, in some cases, with bloody murder, and not really feeling a whole lot about it. After all, they don't feel much guilt, and there is no shame factor involved. So, I think in a nutshell, that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about and explain. You can't, without a cultural bulwark, if you will, behind you, the laying down the law, setting out the rules approach doesn't work. And it doesn't work because, well, women and men are receptive in different ways to the feelings of guilt and shame. Women are primarily shame-driven, and men are primarily guilt-driven. And in the West, a guilt-driven culture with no shame factor whatsoever, that explains why Western women are far more atrocious than Eastern women. I mean, not that any woman is trustworthy in that sense, but you get what I'm saying. Anyway, I've talked a mouthful yet again, and I've had a lot of time recently to make videos, it's true, but that's going to be changing rather rapidly. I'm going to be quite busy these next few weeks, so I hope you enjoyed that little exposition. And recently the pendulum swings back and forth, but recently I did break 2,000 subscribers. I'm back under 2,000, and whilst I'm not a subscription whore, it is a good thing, because the more people that are informed of these ideas, the more men specifically who are informed of these ideas, the better, because they're going to get exposure. And the most important thing is that I think Barbarossa mentioned this many times, but the marriage strike. Let's be frank. The only thing that seems to resonate with women and produce these man up articles and where have all the good men gone is that men just opting out of the system. Nothing else works. I think at the end of the day, we know that's far more effective than political action. So the more men get exposed to these ideas, the more they understand, the better. So more subscribers are always good. And I very, from the bottom of my heart, I'm grateful to the subscribers who appreciate my thoughts and insight. And I'll continue doing this to the extent I have time and I'm not dead. Yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say, I believe. Just plumb through my thoughts. And yeah, that's it. So everyone, take care. I'll hope to see you, well, in the not all too distant future. And I wish you all well, and just keep on doing what you're doing. Keep on spreading the word. Take care.